Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a progressive campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We work with non-profit and community-based organisations, trade unions, progressive businesses and social democratic parties across the globe to develop campaign strategies, train engagement staff in leadership and power building, and help you execute your campaign strategy with data-driven tactics and actions. And in 2022, Dunn Street will continue to work with folks that want to share their stories, take action and organise communities for change. To find out how you can partner with Dunn Street, hit us up at dunstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also brought to you by Morris Blackburn Lawyers. Are you an enthusiastic, client-focused lawyer? Morris Blackburn Lawyers are hiring a lawyer, associate, or a senior associate, geez, Stephen, get the read right, with experience in personal injuries to join their team in Townsville in North Queensland. Note, I didn't say far North Queensland. See, there's a difference. They offer a safe, supportive and collaborative environment backed by inclusive leaders and progressive policies. You'll manage your own file load with heaps of support, and if you're ready to join them on this journey to extend access to justice to more Australians, then you should apply now. Go to morrisblackburn.com.au/careers. Morris Blackburn, experience you can count on. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast, which is out each Friday, that dives into the progressive campaign issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And we're going back overseas today. The midterms are coming up in the United States, that set of elections that they have in the first Tuesday in November, after the first Monday in November. And the House and the Senate are up and a whole bunch of gubernatorial races are coming up. And it's been a while since we've done US politics. So I'm joined online this week by my good friend and Democratic campaign strategist, Katie Parsons, former Obama alumni, is on the show today. We've had Katie on a number of times, and she's going to be back on today from Chicago to talk to us a bit about the midterms. But also we're going to be focusing on the fallout from the Supreme Court's decision on Dobbs versus Jackson, which overturned the long-held precedent, which was Roe v. Wade, which gave women access, a constitutional right to privacy when it came to their own healthcare. So we'll have a big conversation on that. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Stitcher. And if you like the show, be sure to give us 5 stars on Apple Podcast and Spotify. And for all the updates, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Okay, let's get to today's episode. We are taping this one on a Thursday morning on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. Another cold winter's morning here in Melbourne, but the sun is shining on the face of my guest as I can see her sitting here in a lovely home in the windy city, but probably not windy today in Chicago. We're joined again. Hasn't been on the show for a while, actually, so it's great to have her back on. Democratic campaign strategist, Katie Parsons. Welcome back to Socially Democratic.
Hi, thanks. It's great to be back. Yeah, it's been, I went back and checked before this. It's been 2 years.
Has it been that long?
Yeah, the last time we talked, actually, so I will admit my vanity, curiosity. I went back and listened to the last episode, and it was just before the Georgia runoff. So it was also just before January 6th. So it was kind of a blast from the past to go back and listen to that before the chaos broke loose or continued.
Yeah, I know. But yeah, the continued crazy journey that has been American politics since Donald Trump came down those escalators in Trump Tower and said he was going to nominate for the candidacy for the Republican Party. You're right. I mean, so much has changed. When you think back then to that moment and then try and compress all of the things that have happened in that time, I mean, what do you take from it? What are the key lessons for American politics, do you think? I know it's a huge question, I know, but from trying to condense all those moments, like the Georgia runoff, weren't sure we were going to win, obviously didn't see January 6th coming, but were unsure about how Trump was going to handle losing office.
Yeah, no, exactly. Gosh, if I was going to say big takeaways, people, if anything, people are more engaged, right? All of this chaos, anger, frustration, polarization. I think certainly there have been moments where I myself feel and have felt, and I've heard from others, there's a sense of maybe this is a moment to disengage because it's just so um, like emotional to be a part of this moment, and there's a fear also as a campaign strategist that people are going to disengage from the political conversation. But I think there are no signs of that, right? Even when we fear that might happen, the anger on the right, the sort of continued belief in these crazy lies about January 6th and the results of the election, those continue at full force. But also on the Democratic side, we actually won. We continue to win elections and have positive results. And so we're seeing energy on our side too.
It's funny, actually, 2 points. One is just a point which you don't need to respond to if you don't want to, because it's going to be very, very obscure. But I was reading the other day, I started to get back into yacht rock recently. And I was reading on the Wikipedia page about yacht rock. They were saying that the reason why, sort of was like soft progressive rock from 1975 to 1984 is kind of the genre that is described as yacht rock, the Doobie Brothers, Hall and Oates, all that kind of stuff. Right?
Yeah.
And I've been listening to it a lot lately, and they said that it was yacht rock came about in the mid to late 70s as a response to kind of almost like a counter revolution to the revolution that was the counterculture of American pop, which was singing about Vietnam and freedom and protest. And yacht rock was kind of like putting your fingers in your ears, saying, "I don't want to deal with Watergate and with the Vietnam War anymore, and I just want to go on a yacht, or I just want to sort of, like Christopher Cross, I just want to get to the border of Mexico. It's like I just need to. It's escapism.
Yeah,
I don't want to think about it anymore." And apparently,
it's very positive, gentle.
Yeah, absolutely. Guys in touch with their feelings, something very rare that was at that time in music, and like Michael McDonald and all that kind of stuff. Anyway. And apparently there's a resurgence in yacht rock right now, and they think it's because it's a response to what's going on in American politics right now, particularly with Trump. People are like, I just don't want to deal with it anymore.
Yeah.
But you're saying though that there is a bit of a resurgence in also there is great urgency on the Democratic side, because sometimes if you read the news, you feel like it's actually that the Democrats aren't winning. And even though you're right, you look at all the results most recently, the Democrats are winning, but it just looks like they're losing. Mentally, I just can't get that balance right.
Totally. No, and it's honestly, I'm almost thinking to myself, I can't believe that I said those things, because I'm generally not that optimistic. But you're exactly right, right? It feels like we are constantly failing, but that's not actually accurate. And there is still a lot of energy, despite also true at the same time, this sense of, oh my God, I can't believe I still have to deal with this. I'm probably going to continue to have to deal with this, in 2, 4, 6 years, et cetera. So those things are both existing at the same time.
So we'll talk about electoral enthusiasm later in the podcast, but I actually wanted to start with the Supreme Court and the decision that was handed down. Well, actually, it was leaked. Then it was handed down in June this year. This year's been a bit of a blur. I can't believe it's August.
The 24th.
Yes. Okay, there you go. It's a date that will probably remain in infamy for a long time. The decision on the case of Dobbs v. Jackson's Women's Health Organization, in which the court held that the Constitution of the United States does not confer a right to abortion. Take us through the decision by the court to overturn essentially Roe v. Wade, a long-standing precedent. Just unpack it for us, for those who have been not paying attention to the news lately.
Sure. Well, I will preface that I'm certainly not a lawyer or a legal scholar. I work in politics and campaigns, but as a person who's paid close attention, I'll do my best. So the ruling was really shocking, because the question in front of the court wasn't actually in and of itself about Roe v. Wade, right? It wasn't, somebody didn't come up and call the question on that. It was really around a law in Mississippi that was going to be more restrictive than some other states' laws on when a person was still able to have access to abortion. And so the Supreme Court could have just ruled on that. And in that ruling, it was 6-3. I actually don't remember who was the plaintiff, but it was 6-3 in support of the Mississippi law, which would have made abortion after 15 weeks of pregnancy no longer legal in the state. They could have stopped there. They pushed forward, and in a 5-4 decision also overturned the whole thing, Roe v. Wade, and kicked the question back to states. So, like you said, they argued that there was no constitutional right to access to abortion, and therefore it was a question for the states to make. The ruling itself, or the majority opinion, goes into great detail about, was there any historical evidence that there was protection for abortion access, and that's really what they're resting their argument on, that there was no, there was nothing to base a decision on in history or in the Constitution. It's really scary, and I know we'll get into this more, but sort of what that means for other things that we consider to be rights at this point. It's a frightening precedent for that.
You remember the date of when it was handed down. When you first heard this news, how did you compress this information?
Yeah, so I had forgotten that it works this way, except that it was so present for all of us this year that you couldn't escape it. The Supreme Court, does all of its courtly things kind of behind the scenes, and then there's roughly a 2-week period in the summer each year when they hand down their rulings, and it's sort of like a constant drumbeat during those 2 weeks of when you get all of their decisions from the cases that they've been arguing, citing on for the past year or years. So we had already had, I think we'd already had like a week and a half of these Supreme Court decisions, which all of them had been in a similar vein, a real shift in the direction of the court, much more extreme, much more originalist in their interpretation for all of the rulings. So it had been a real downer of a couple of weeks in the first place. And then I think it was maybe a Wednesday or a Thursday of that final week of rulings when, we all knew it was coming. We knew it was coming, but it was just a question of how closely would that ruling align with what had been leaked. And so when it came out, instantaneously, everybody's talking about it, looking at how closely or not it deviated from what had been leaked. And of course, it was pretty much exactly what had been previewed. Rage. There was a lot of rage during all of those 2 weeks, but after that ruling in particular, lots of feelings that are not appropriate for public consumption. I think a lot of people felt that way.
Katie, it's okay. We're Australians. You can swear as much as you
like.
And you have every right to as well. I watched a series on Hulu maybe a year, 2 years ago about a woman who I'd never even heard of before, Phyllis Schlafly, which was the sort of the drama series. I forgot the bloody name of it. I even we reviewed on this show. What was the name of the show? Mrs. America.
Yeah, it was. Okay. Yep.
And
I haven't seen it, but I remember when it came out. Yeah.
Kate Blanchett plays Phyllis Schlafly. It talks about the Equal Rights Amendment campaign in the 1960s and 70s. If anyone's not seen it, go and watch it. I can't remember what it's on in Australia. I think it's either on Stan or maybe Foxtel or something. Anyway, I can't help but think that having seen that documentary, that this campaign to overturn Roe v. Wade didn't begin, a year ago or 2 years ago when a lot of these Southern Republican red states were starting to challenge a woman's right to choose in their local court system and slowly take it up to the Supreme Court. I feel like this has been in the making since, Barry Goldwater, Phyllis Schlafly, these types of characters that have been seeking to undermine this major landmark case, which was Roe v. Wade.
Yeah.
Just want to give us an insight about this campaign, how the prolonged campaign that's been going on for.
Yeah, it has been a concerted effort by evangelicals, far-right conservatives for a long time. And I think this is definitely one of the deep frustrations of many people who feel like the Democratic Party has been caught asleep a little bit, right? Because the conservatives have been telling us what their priorities are from the beginning, just like Trump, right? They've told us what they were trying to do. They've been systematic in electing people to state legislatures where they can change state-based laws that create, each time they do that, they create opportunities to put this in front of the Supreme Court and get a ruling that eventually would be to their liking. They've also made a concerted effort to place judges who would rule to their liking at state level courts all the way up to the Supreme Court. So yeah, I think you're exactly right. This has been a long time in the making, and it wasn't a secret.
So then the follow-up question is, what were the Democrats asleep at the wheel? Did they do enough beforehand?
Oh, this is such a deep question, right? I think on the one hand, it wasn't unreasonable to feel like this is settled, right? It's not unreasonable for people to think, oh yeah, those are the loonies. They're pushing on this, and let them wear themselves out on this fight. There's no way that Roe could be overturned, so we're not going to spend precious energy on passing, for example, national legislation, national protection. I think there's some legitimacy to that argument. Also, we haven't been in a position to have enough control of national Congress to be able to pass national legislation, really at any point. I mean, so in the last couple of years, when we do have a Democratic majority in both chambers, there have been efforts to pass, I think it's called the Women's Health Protection Act. Yes, WHPA, Women's Health Protection Act. So there have been attempts to pass that, and it actually has passed in the House twice in the last 2 years, but we didn't have a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate, and so weren't able to pass that in the Senate. I think similarly, when we had control in 2008 to 2010, certainly there's been a lot of argument internally in the party in the last couple of months of why didn't we codify it then? I don't know. I have a hard time excusing it, but at the same time, I remember, everybody was focused completely on passing the ACA. And then the second big piece of legislation was climate, and we couldn't even get two of those. So, these are massive fights. It's not something that we would have never been able to get it through without a fight. I think other arguments, should we have made it more of a centerpiece of the political argumentation in all of the elections over the last couple of years? Yeah, maybe.
Because the Republicans have been for the better part. I mean, even as far back as Karl Rove and.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. It's a great way to mobilize their base, right? And it just wasn't as effective as a mobilization tool for Democrats, because it's always the case, right? When you're in a position of protecting something you already have, people get complacent. It's much harder to mobilize people to actually go out on the streets to say, protect this thing you already have, and there's no evidence that there's an immediate threat that's credible, right? It's much easier to get people fired up about something that is a challenge to the status quo, and that's the position that the Republicans have been in for the last 40 years.
I guess that's where I can only think about sort of Marshall Ganson public narrative and story of now, and lifting up the urgency, the urgent threat that people are facing right now. And maybe that's something we probably missed that opportunity to talk about. Yeah, okay, sure, this is Roe v. Wade is law, but here is examples of the threat that we are facing if we are to, I guess there's enough evidence there to point to the fact that the Republicans were slowly getting control of the Supreme Court would suggest.
Yeah.
I mean, what they did with Merrick Garland when he was Obama's nominee for the Supreme Court, and Mitch McConnell just said no, and then completely hypocritically flipped on his own argument to then rush through. Was it Amy Barrett? I can't remember.
Yeah, Coney Barrett.
There's enough evidence there to suggest that the Republicans will win this win at all costs attitude. I don't understand how the Democrats didn't try and mobilize it, at least around that.
Right. Well, that was at the end of Obama's term, right, when that happened, and certainly we did scream, right, from the rooftops about not seating Merrick Garland. Exactly like you said, the hypocrisy of that move by Mitch McConnell. I think there was a huge amount of anger. It wasn't necessarily specifically focused on abortion, but that was certainly a part of the conversation. But Trump won the election, right? So we didn't have, and unfortunately, he was in a position to seat 3 justices, which almost never happens, right? I don't know how long it's been since the last time that happened, but it's pretty unusual. Most presidents get 2. So that just dramatically changed the shape and flavor of the court over the last 6 years. And we weren't in a position to do something about that, again, given that we didn't have filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. And clearly, unfortunately, even though we did have a majority, there wasn't the appetite to remove filibuster.
So now that we've had this decision handed down, and as you said, both you and I are not legal scholars in this, but I just want to get the broader legal implications from this decision. What are we starting to see happen in these more conservative states? Are they taking this moment in time to really start to change laws and bring in more restrictions for women's access to health?
Yeah. Well, it's state by state, right? I think we talked about this last time in the context of how elections are governed, right? When you kick something back to the states, it truly is decided on a state by state level. And so it's hard to talk about one universal outcome from this, but there were a number of states that had already passed trigger laws. And again, this is a sign of how strategic and coordinated the right has been on lining things up to put us in this position. So those trigger laws were written, even though they were not in effect because of Roe v. Wade. These were laws that banned abortion. In many cases, it banned abortion under any circumstance. There are a few states where it's a full ban on abortion, except in the case of rape, incest, or health of the mother. Even in those cases where health of the mother is a consideration, there's a huge amount of confusion about what that actually means. So those trigger bans, I think it was immediately there were 11 states where abortion became no longer legal, and then I think there have been another 2 since the ruling, and then there are another handful of states where there's either a sense that that's happening, in the next couple of months, or it's at high risk if there's a change in, say, the governor in that state, where you've got a very conservative state legislature but a Democratic governor. If that switches in some of these upcoming elections, they could pass legislation at the state level. So, in general conversation, we say about half of the states have banned completely or nearly completely access to abortion, and in the other half of the states, that access is still protected.
It's a scary thought to think about, and obviously the implications that are having on women, particular women who are in lower socioeconomic backgrounds. It's not easy for them to. I mean, I know that we're hearing a lot of stories of women crossing the border into other states where they have access, but for someone who can't afford to get on a flight or can't afford the petrol to drive to, and America's a big place. Some of these states here we're talking.
That's right.
These are big states. There's a lot of country to drive. Like, what's the implications happening? What are we seeing on the ground there for women?
Yeah, so there was immediately a real groundswell of support for these different organizations in the states where abortion access is protected. There are these access funds. So I know I Give Money Midwest Access Coalition. There's also, I think, Chicago Abortion Fund, something like this. These fund organizations which collect money and then will help to provide, travel fees, or in a lot of cases it's childcare, right? Many of these folks already have children, right? And so they have to take that into consideration when they're also making a decision to travel to get access to abortion. So there are a lot of these funds. People have been pumping money into those, which is lovely to see. I mean, it shouldn't be necessary, but at least there's some action that can happen there. At the same time, we're hearing, like devastating stories about people who simply aren't able to access abortion. So they're either being forced to carry to term, or you have the sort of more, what do you want to call it? The stories that are occupying a lot of column space, and I'm sure you will hear a lot about in election ads moving forward, which is, women who have complications in their pregnancies. And so for medical reasons, a doctor would normally advocate termination, but they're not able to do that because the folks are not bleeding out yet, basically, right? It's not quite so urgent that they're definitely going to die. So the doctors are afraid that they could be prosecuted, because it's not like, the question of whether the mother's health is at risk is not clear. So you're hearing stories of people having to wait much longer, their health being put at greater risk because of these rules. Those are the kinds of things we're hearing about.
I often think when I read about some of those articles and the position that doctors have been put in, the Hippocratic oath about do no harm, I just assume that it's a no-brainer to say, well, I don't give a shit what the state says. This is what I'm going to do. Has there been a backlash from any sort of medical bodies or anything like that we're seeing?
Oh, yeah. So that's a great question. I am not aware of, though I'm sure it exists, the like professional medical bodies coming out and stating that this is, it puts us in an impossible position, all of that. I'm sure they're advocating for that. We're hearing more, I would say, from individual doctors and nurses who are just exasperated by this situation. But this is also an incredibly litigious country. There are also, in some of these states, they can even be, the doctors are, face like criminal prosecution, right? So people are taking that risk really seriously.
I know, and there's some in some of the states, it's a crime to cross state boundaries to go seek an abortion. Is that right? Is that something that's been debated?
It's certainly been discussed. It hasn't happened yet. There have been some pretty bold moves to try to protect your right or ability to go to another state to seek an abortion. Sort of along the same vein, we now have access to an abortion pill, right? Chemical abortion, and women in states where abortion is no longer legal still have access to the pill if they can order it through the mail. But there's a lot of question around states going after that ability, right? Or because they're making the argument that it doesn't matter if it's a pill or a doctor, right? It's an abortion and it's illegal in our state. So I'm sure you will see that start to crop up, like actual test cases of that. I think it would be harder to try to prosecute people who cross state lines, but probably we will see those tests too.
Don't hold your breath.
Right.
You know what I mean?
That's the real lesson.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk. You touched on this in your earlier remarks, so let's dive a bit deeper on this. Some of the I get a sense that the judges write their own papers in the decision, and a couple of them, Alito and Thomas, seem to go a little bit further in their decisions. That was making an argument that not only that is Roe v. Wade can be overturned, but there's another set of precedents that have been established law for a number of years are also now in question. Do you want to just sort of talk a bit about that?
Yeah, that was definitely after the leak, and then immediately after the ruling came down, there was definitely a lot of fear and discussion about what this means for other rights that we've realized in the last couple of years, right? Gay marriage in particular. There's also been, people have also talked about interracial marriage, so I don't think that's actually at risk. But the reason for that is that the part of what was overturned in the majority opinion was basing our right to access abortion on right to privacy, right? That's sort of what underpinned Roe. And we don't actually have, it's not written anywhere that we have a right to privacy. That is sort of upheld by the 14th Amendment, due process clause. Again, we're reaching the boundaries of my legal knowledge here. But
Katie, it's sounding incredibly impressive, though. That's the important thing, okay?
Great. Glad to hear it. So basically, the argument was that is not enough. That was not enough to uphold the right to abortion. So Thomas, and actually, I'm not sure how normal it is for so many of the justices to write their own differing opinions. There were quite a few in this time. Maybe it happens all the time, but certainly we don't all pay attention to it the way that we have in this one. Thomas did imply, like, oh yeah, this throws the doors wide open. Let's go back and review all of these other things. I think actually Alito and definitely Kavanaugh, surprisingly, kind of went to pains to say this doesn't open the floodgates. We are not suggesting that we revisit those things. Now, understandably, I think everybody's a little skeptical of that because we've heard that before, right? That this is a boundary that they're not going to cross. So when you hear that reassurance, the hopeful side of me thinks, okay, they're drawing a line. They want to signal to us, and I should take that reassurance. But of course, evidence is showing us that I don't know if we can take that to be true.
Well, Senator Sue Collins of Maine took private reassurances from Brett Kavanaugh when he was seeking his seat on the court that Roe was untouchable, and that proved to be wrong.
Yeah, well, and I think they've all said that, right? They've all been asked that in some way or another, and everybody has gone to great lengths to say either, I have no opinion on that, or I'll evaluate the merits of the case and all of that kind of stuff. So, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I don't. It's certainly been a great meme that right that Susan Collins has gotten reassurances that that's going to be protected. We shouldn't have been in that position in the first place. right?
No, we should not have. Okay, let's. I want to use this question as a segue into now talking about the midterms and elections. Let's get back onto some turf that you and I.
Great. Awesome.
We're just humble
Phew.
organisers trying to do a job here. Okay, one thing that I got a bit of hope from, speaking of the story of now, is what happened in Kansas. There was a Republican primary race
Oh, yeah.
last week or a couple of weeks ago in which
Yeah.
only registered Republicans could vote in it, but at the same time, the state house also put on the ballot I think, was it a referendum?
Ballot initiative.
Ballot initiative.
Essentially, yeah.
And thinking that, yeah, okay, we can bring in some more restrictive laws here in our own state around abortion. Tell us the background of that, and then what happened.
Yeah. Oh, what a great day. I think it was August 2nd, so last week at some point, when this election happened. So the Republicans, like you said, or supporters of anti-choice, had put a ballot initiative on the ballot before Supreme Court ruling, right? All of that stuff has to be done much earlier than the election itself. So they put it on the primary ballot. It's not that only Republicans could vote. There was also a Democratic primary. It's just that because Kansas is so conservative, there often are, there aren't two Democrats running for most seats. There's one person who will sort of go like lamb to the slaughter on the, general election day as the Democrat. It's certainly not contested in the primary. So there's not much turnout amongst Democrats because why on earth would they bother? I mean, I wish they would, but they don't. So there's right. There's low Democratic turnout during this primary. It's mostly Republicans. You can also register. I think you could register as an independent, or not an independent, but unaffiliated, to be able to vote in this ballot initiative. And yeah, they were super smug. They thought this was going to be a home run. And I'm sure the intention of this was also, again, to like set up a trigger situation. I was looking at this just before. The voter registration in Kansas on June 24th jumped by 1,000%. There was absolutely, literally 1,000. There was massive energy. Now, some of the I don't know if it was the county clerks or somebody, Secretary of State, was saying, we don't know if this is just because of the Dobbs ruling. It's the last couple of weeks. So this is anyway when we see a large increase in registration. We don't want to read too much into this, but I think we saw the results and they spoke for themselves, right? You had massive turnout in this primary. You had, even in extremely conservative districts where the majority of the voters are voting in the Republican primary, the ballot initiative failed, which was good for us, even in those places that were rural and conservative. So, that tells us there are Republicans voting to maintain access in Kansas. So, yeah, I think this was, oh man, what a huge moment for all, just like a real sigh of relief. Okay, we haven't all lost our minds. This is actually possible. I think there are a couple of lessons from this going into the midterms in general. I assume that's where you want to go with this, right? Like, what does this mean for November? And there's certainly lots of folks commenting on that too. So there are a couple things here. One, remember that it was a ballot initiative in Kansas. It wasn't. So essentially, that's you're not necessarily part of one party or another when you're voting for that ballot initiative. You're voting on the issue itself. In most places in November, if a voter is going to the polling booth and they want to vote to protect access to abortion in their state, most of the time they have to vote for a candidate, right? It's like in certain states where you're really relying on the state attorney, or in most places it's about who's the governor, right? So you're asking, if you want to change the results of that election, you're either looking for massive Democratic turnout in those places, or unusually high turnout, or you need to switch some Republican votes. And I think it is going to be harder to win those Republican votes to vote for a Democratic gubernatorial candidate than it is to win on a ballot initiative, which is essentially not, apolitical or apartisan, nonpartisan. Woo, okay. So that is some argument, that we shouldn't just expect that we're going to sweep all of these races because there's so much support for access to abortion. It'll be a little bit harder than where there's a ballot initiative. But I think, we also saw massive turnout. We saw huge new registration. And I think we're going to see in key demographics, suburban women, most notably, I think we're going to see those folks voting, making strategic choices to protect access to abortion in their states. And it's just a question of how many, and is it enough?
Yeah, to echo your sentiment, major moment of hope. And you're right. I mean, I don't think that, Kansas is going to become a blue state, but certainly what I took from it, to your point, was, women, or even more broadly, just folks, but in particular women in the suburban congressional districts where there are tight races right now that Democrats need to hold on to the House. Because I think before all this happened, I think if we'd done this podcast pre the Dobbs decision, we probably would have thought the House is gone. I want to get a sense of you. This is going to be my question at the moment. Do you think that this is, are we back in the game? Because I feel like this is a bit of a game shift. I think that maybe the Republicans have overcooked this. They've probably gone, they're going pretty hard. American politics, most liberal Western democracies, success happens in the center, not on the fringes. And I think that the Republican Party have this time gone too far to the right. And I think that our democracy should be correcting that and then bring it back to the center. And will we see that in this midterm?
Yeah, exactly right. If we were having this conversation 2 weeks ago, or however many weeks ago, both because of Dobbs, but also because of the Inflation Reduction Act, right? This finally the massive piece of legislation that has passed the Senate, which was really the major test, and hopefully will make it to the president's desk, I think, end of the week is what we're hearing. So those two things together, I think, are what are really creating finally some momentum for Democrats. So what I think we're looking at, and what I think, polling and other folks are saying too, is we actually have a pretty good chance of holding the Senate this time around, which was not a given by any means, but because of this ruling, and then also because the Republicans have put in some absolute wackadoodle candidates for those Senate seats that honestly, they were really competitive. If they had put more centrist candidates, I think it would have been a different story. But because of that, I think we're looking at a decent chance of holding on to the Senate, maybe even gaining seats, which could potentially mean we're in a position to overturn the filibuster, which would then allow us to do some of these other things, like passing a national legislation to protect access. So that's on the Senate side. I think it still doesn't look great in the House. And that's really because of redistricting and the way that those seats are drawn. They're just more polarized. So they're more polarized. It's also that there are more democratically held seats currently that are considered to be toss-ups. There are more Democrats who have decided they're not going to run next time, so they're open seats. It's more of an uphill battle for us. And while the winds are shifting in our favor for the first time in a long time, even in the House, I think I still wouldn't put money on us winning the House. But last time we talked, I said I wouldn't put money on winning even one senator in Georgia, and we won both. So, maybe don't take my advice when you're betting.
The last time we had elections in the United States, which was November last year, I think there was New Jersey, there was races, there was the state house in Virginia was up for grabs, and a couple of others. And the
Those were the
research,
big ones.
the research off the back of that election period was that Republicans ran localized campaigns, as in the messages, the policies, the platforms that they were taking to the voters were very localized. It was about jobs and the economy and schools and education and all that kind of stuff. Which, and I say that out loud, that's exactly what Social Democratic Party should be talking about. But anyway, and they did well. They had a reasonably good run in those elections. The Democrats, the research of Democratic voters, registered Democrats that didn't bother to turn out to vote, was because they saw the Democratic Party just spending their time fighting in Washington and not getting their shit together, so they didn't bother turning out to support their Democratic candidates.
Yeah.
First of all, I mean, I don't know if that's the truth. I don't know whether you want to challenge that in the first instance. But are we seeing lessons learned going into these midterms that Democrats are now starting to focus a little bit more on local issues and less on? Because when I read the front page of the New York Times, I know the New York Times isn't exactly the mouthpiece for the American people, but it's January 6th. Above the fold, this is what's the headlines. It's January 6th. It's indecision in Congress. It's cost of living. It's inflation, and it's California wildfires. So that's kind of what I'm getting out of your news at the moment. And I don't see a lot of. If I was a independent or an undecided voter or a persuadable voter, I would be asking, well, what's this Democratic Congress doing for me? So what are we seeing in this campaign?
Yeah, that's great. So there are a couple of things there that I want to tackle. So on one, the reading of how the Republicans ran, particularly in New Jersey and Virginia, which are pretty purple, right? Really almost more Democratic, I would say, certainly at a presidential level. So it was surprising that Republicans did so well or won in those two states. And you're right, they ran on localized issues, in particular education, right? And when we say education, what we really mean there is they ran on this, these stories about the crazy things that your teachers are teaching your kids, and they're so radical, and you as a parent should have a right to say what your kids are taught, and you should have a bigger voice in your local schools. So and on crime a lot as well, which is a strength for Republicans right now, and still unfortunately a weakness for us, at least in national messaging. So those are local issues. They're also issues that are really easy to tell stories about, right? It's really easy to use those extreme examples of, here's this, this one teacher in one classroom once said this crazy thing. Okay, we're going to spin up a whole campaign narrative around that. It's pretty easy to do. Similarly with egregious instances of crime. So we know that those powerful stories really work. And the Republicans were using that and kind of distancing themselves from Trump in those cases. They're away from the national message, where Democrats were trying to make it about Trump and the national messages in those states. And going national did not work well for us. So I think the flip side of that is, Democrats know better. We know better. We did really well in 2018 by talking about healthcare and talking about lowering drug prices, that we were going to, everybody running was told to zero in on, how they're going to make healthcare more affordable. And we did really well running on that message. So I am hopeful, and this is why I mentioned the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which used to be known as Build Back Better, right? But under different management, basically. I think that's going to be a really powerful platform for Democrats to work with this time, because there is a lot in that legislation around reducing costs of medication, allowing Medicare to negotiate prices. Like, these are super boring things for us to talk about, but they're extremely effective campaign messages. And you will see lots of campaign ads from Democrats talking about both what they were able to achieve, thank goodness, and I hope they will also focus on, here's what we're going to do next, right? Because we can't just talk about the couple of things that we've been able to get done. The other lesson for me that I almost think is so obvious, like whether you've defined the lesson or not, I think people are applying it, is that abortion is creating all of these powerful stories and powerful messages for candidates to talk about in their campaigns. And they are the kinds of things that voters are latching onto. It's really concrete. It's really emotional. Somebody took something away from me. How dare they? I want to get that back. Like, these are all great winning messages for us. So I hope that we are able to turn those into actual victories, because you're right. The messages about inflation, I think, are finally starting to go in our direction. Maybe a little bit. Maybe in 2 months we'll actually have turned the tide on that and have that as continuing momentum behind Democrats. That would be great. But those are harder things for us. The national messaging is harder for us.
Going back to that second last point you made there, I mean, if you look at the and correct me here if I'm wrong, but the numbers in states like Georgia, Arizona, that were Nevada, that were wins for Biden in the 2020 presidential were built off the back of women, and so not suggesting they're a homogenous group, but women, particularly in the suburbs, turned out to vote, not just Democratic registered women, but also independents, but also moderate Republicans who didn't want Trump to become president. Like, Gwinnett County, Maricopa County, these kind of counties we saw, which have been historically Republican middle-class counties, right, turned Democratic. And I'm just wondering if you're, if you're a Democratic strategist, you are a Democratic strategist. I would just be leaning in on trying to get this woman vote out, both your own base, but also independents, and also start to move into the moderate side of the Republican base, going, things have got a little crazy here, and we just kind of need to bring this thing back home and just make sure that we're all a bit sensible.
Absolutely. And I feel like the abortion stories are doing direct battle with these local school decision-making stories, right? Those are the same audiences. And that's why the tide was sort of shifting for Republicans before this, because they were really winning on those education messages, which, interestingly, maybe kind of started in Hungary. This is like something that Orban initiated and found to be an effectiveness. Anyway, so I won't take it there. But yes, I think abortion is a powerful message to counteract the effectiveness of these education stories, particularly with those audiences. I think, as you were saying, there were lots of stories about 2020 that talked about the importance of the suburban woman voter. Also, people of color were really important blocks for us. And those are folks who, well, it depends on who we're talking about here, but we're seeing a lot of disenchantment, disillusionment with the lack of success in Congress over the last 2 years, particularly with those blocks. So my hope is, again, that as we start to see some big wins, that a little bit of that motivation will return. That is separate from Latino voters, in particular, in particular parts of the country where we are seeing a shift from Democrats to Republicans amongst some of the more like conservative and culturally conservative and evangelical communities, which, maybe this is maybe this is counterproductive with them talking about abortion. I don't know. But these are all things that are in the mix. They are things that I would look at, when you look at the results after the election on this November, to see how are those things playing out, these different blocks.
It's funny, as you're talking about that, I was actually thinking about Texas, and I was thinking about the Latino community, and I was thinking about how we're a little bit stunned by some of those districts around Houston and the lower part of Texas.
The Rio Grande Valley.
Yeah, that didn't come home for the Democrats in 2020. And then I started to sort of think, I just think that sometimes we, as a Catholic myself, we shouldn't make assumptions based on people's faith. And I know that, look, politics a lot of time it's assumption making. African American voters do this, women do this. They're all one big homogenous group, and we sort of think that this is how they move. I wonder what's going on in the homes, the private homes, and the minds of Catholic Latino women seeing this national debate around abortion, because I think that I would make the hypothesis that I think even they think it's going too far.
Yeah, actually, and polling has shown that so one of the most effective messages with more centrist or conservative leaning people, women and other people, is that even if they personally don't believe in abortion, wouldn't have an abortion themselves, they are really turned off by the idea of the government having control over this decision, which is ultimately a personal decision. There's been lots of really interesting polling that has shown that if you talk about this as a government overreach, government interference, nothing to do with abortion, just why is the government making this decision, which is a private decision between me and my doctor and my family and all of those things, that is super effective. And that's true. That has been shown to be true with Latino voters as well. So I think you're right. We shouldn't make those assumptions by any stretch of the imagination. But we are still seeing certain segments of the Latino population moving away from the party, and we need to take serious steps to win them back and understand where we can't actually count on those votes and need to do something else.
And it's a growing population as well, so it's something the Democratic Party really need to address soon. Otherwise, we talk about the demographics of America shifting to being far more black and brown, while the Latino community make up a large proportion of the American population, and they continue to grow. And if they are not able to win the hearts and minds of those voters, then that's going to be a bit of a challenge, particularly in growing states like Texas.
Yeah.
Last question. I want to talk about. Last topic, I should say, the January 6th committee, which I have found quite fascinating. Like, notwithstanding the fact that we've just made an argument that we need to stop talking about all the chaos in Washington to win elections, I do think that the January 6th committee is doing something in terms of taking the rub off Donald Trump, the shine off Donald Trump. So much so that I actually hope that Trump wins the GOP nomination. I know that sounds crazy, right? But I think that if he gets it, they lose. He's only won one election. So anyway, January 6th committee. First of all, what are your thoughts on the committee? Where do you see this playing out? There's a big argument, obviously, right now between them and the Justice Department about, because everyone's sort of wanting this is just a bloody parliamentary committee. Like, whoop-de-doo. Hand this stuff over to the Justice Department. Let's start getting some prosecutions going, people. Let's put some people in jail. Lock them up. What's going on there?
Yeah, I agree. When you first had the announcements that these committee hearings were going to start, I definitely was among the group who were kind of rolling their eyes, like, really, what are we going to learn? What are we going to get out of this? Yes, for posterity's sake, I'm glad that somebody is, I struggle to say holding to account, because there's no holding to account, but at least documenting what happened, right? So yes, yay, glad that's happening, but is it actually going to make any difference? I didn't really think so, but I have been really pleasantly surprised by the outcome and the impacts of each one of those hearings, right? They've been masterfully produced to really have the maximum effect, right? And are there things that we learned that we didn't know? around the details, yes, right. There are definitely some like great juicy details that came out about this. Did Trump lunge at the driver? Yeah, right. And I think it was surprising to see the evidence of how deeply he was involved. In advance, that he did know that this was happening and totally condoned it and wanted to participate, all of those things. To hear those facts, even if you kind of suspected them, still had more of an emotional impact than I expected. And I think there was a real sense of, they were wise to put many Republicans at the front of this. Now, unfortunately, we only had 2 Republican members of Congress who were part of the committee, but you had so many people testifying who are part of the party, and I think it gave it some weight and seriousness. It didn't feel like a show trial, even though I'm sure Trump and the right will say that it was. It felt serious. So I was really happy, to see that happened. I agree that perhaps it may have taken some of the rub off. I like that term, but the folks who are watching this are already the people who were inclined to at least question who he was or is as a person. So I definitely. I don't want to see him as the nominee for the Republicans. I think it's extremely likely that he will be. Yes, maybe, I hope, we've beat him before. I think we certainly can beat him again, but why take that risk? I think, and the damage that it will do just to have him as a candidate. There was such a true emotional weight lifted when he was kicked off of Twitter. And kicked off of Twitter and then no longer the president, right? It's a palpable change in just like the level of tension in everyday life wherever you live, and I don't look forward to that returning under any circumstances.
But if he doesn't win the nomination, then who does? Do you think?
Great question. I think DeSantis certainly looks in best position right now. And he's awful too.
Yeah, I was going to say, he's just as bad as Trump, but he's probably more effective a communicator. Sorry, that's not right. I think that he would be more effective as a president.
Yeah.
From a policy standpoint, I think there's chaos reigned in the West Wing. I think when Trump was in there, so I don't think they actually got a lot of shit done.
Right.
I think he would be far more clinical in trying to pass the things that he wants. He would change America greater than Trump would. That's why I think that actually Trump's probably better being the top of the ticket. So I don't think Trump's going to win.
Yeah, I hear that. And there's definitely a double-edged sword to that, right? Like, do you want the person who is more effective at passing their awful policies or not? But I think the damage that Trump does is far beyond even policy, right? He is demolishing our institutions step by step. And I don't know if you've seen all this stuff about and I've forgotten, there's like a certain name for it. It's like Document F or something. I'm sure that's not right, but basically the Trump's inner circle, their plan to get rid of the whole slew of civil servants if he were to win the presidency and replace them with political appointees. I mean, political appointees exist now, but they're not in the positions to do much that's effective, right? They're just sort of at the very top. They set the tone. They mostly control the comms. They're not the ones, in the guts doing the work. And they have this whole plan to completely change that. That is terrifying. That is terrifying to me. And now that I say that, I don't know if DeSantis, he could also just say, hey, I'm going to do that same thing. But I hope that that's not the case. I just think even at his worst, I don't know. I was about to say he couldn't be worse, but then we had Bush and thought nothing could be worse. So, you never know.
Last question. Who will be the presidential nominee for the Democratic Party in 2024? There's obviously a lot of talk about Joe, his age. God love him.
Yep.
What are your thoughts?
I will say it's a question, and the fact that it's a question is a story in and of itself. The outcome of the midterms is going to have, I think, a real impact on what happens next, right? And you won't see any real movement one way or the other until after the midterms, I'm sure. All indications are that he intends to run, and if he intends to run, then I think it would be very surprising if he were not the nominee. So it's really a question of whether he's going to run.
It seems like he's locking down support from potential rivals that could nominate against him. I think he caught up with Bernie Sanders and sought a commitment from him that he wouldn't run as long as Joe was running. I think Elizabeth Warren was another person that he reached out to. So clearly it's an indication that if he's not running, he's certainly setting himself up to be able to run again in.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. No, and anybody in his administration would say he is running and he will be the nominee, right? But what you say in those circumstances doesn't mean that that's actually going to be what happens. So I think, I would bet a whole lot of money that he is going to be the nominee.
There we go. We'll see. We'll come back in 2 years' time and listen to this podcast again and see where we're at.
I'm going to be broke.
I know. I'm not a gambling person.
I know, all these bad bets. Yeah.
Well, I won't ask you to make predictions about. You kind of did actually about the midterms, but we'll see how that pans out. Katie Parsons, once again, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been too long. I can't believe it's been. In my mind, I feel like I check in with you every 12 months, but obviously not. That's on me. I'll make sure that we don't do that again. It's been wonderful to hear from you and talk to you and get your insights on a whole bunch of things. And we wish you and the party and progressives in the United States the best of luck heading into the midterms in November this year.
Thank you. Thank you. It's so much fun. Definitely do. Ask me back. We'll be ready to go.
Hey there. Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. And to get all the latest updates on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday.